Dr. Skinner, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're going to ask if you'll just share with us some opening comments on our topic today, which is the Constitution and national sovereignty, and then we'll go to questions.
First of all, thanks for having me. I love these conversations. It's so important to bring Americans together from all walks of life to talk about the key challenges facing our nation and the world. I can't think of a bigger one than national sovereignty. And it's so important that you pair that concept with the US Constitution. Brilliant idea, seems pretty simple, but it's frayed around the edges over the many decades. So this is very timely. In terms of opening remarks, I will say that if you look at our system of government, everyone on this call knows a lot about it. We've got three branches of government. We have an executive that really is charged with protecting our nation and our people. And the nation is the core unit of analysis for most nations in the world. Most people see themselves inside of a state, a nation state. And actually, over time, since World War II, as the US emerged from that war, the US was the predominant power on earth, and we did a lot for the rest of the world. The Marshall Plan to help revive Europe. We helped set up the United Nations. We helped set up the Bretton Woods financial system. We helped support other nations as they were on the path to stronger governance. Decades later, we supported democratic movements around the world, especially as the Cold War was ending, the color revolutions in Eastern Europe, and then democracy promotion in the Middle East in the 21st century under George W. Bush. Why do I mention all of that? Because using our Constitution as a guide, our focus has been on the nation state. And that if you get a nation state that is whole and free, that's representative, that has free and frequent elections, there has been a belief in the United States and much of the West that you will have more prosperity for people, that you will have less war, that you will have greater trade, and that all of these things are connected. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. There's empirical evidence on both sides that more democracy does not necessarily lead to more global peace, but it's a huge belief. What has happened over time, however, is that in the process of helping the rest of the world, of which Americans continually do, we're such a generous nation in terms of philanthropy, in terms of military aid. Look at what the US is doing in Ukraine, in terms of economic assistance, in terms of all of the ways that nations need support. The idea of the nation state as the core unit of analysis in the international system has been diminished. And so multilateral organizations, regional organizations, the United Nations organization, as an organization, the World Health Organization, all of these have grown bigger in terms of bureaucracies, in terms of power and influence on people's lives. And it is really, I think, up to the United States to help rebalance the relationship between international and multilateral organizations and the independence that states have. And that's what I think is critical in the discussion about national sovereignty. It's often seen as a bad word, but I pose the question, where are people most secure, have economic opportunity, have growth and security? It's inside the state. Where do we vote? We vote inside of a state. We don't have a global vote. So I think returning to this idea that the nation state needs to be respected, political and territorial sovereignty need to be respected, because in fact, states may get along better if they're more intact. So that's how I'd like to start the conversation.
Well, thank you. That's a great introduction to the topic. And I love how you reference the nation state, and especially the point that that's where our vote is. And, we are a republic. And we don't have a global vote. So I think that's just a really great point. Tova, I'm going to go ahead and turn to you for questions.
Well, thank you. That was a great overview. And I just wanted to ask if you could start with just a basic definition, maybe for some of our viewers who aren't familiar, about what national sovereignty is and how it's understood by the US, and why it's so salient now, for instance, with Russia-Ukraine war.
So, great way to pose an initial question. 1648, we get the Westphalian international system emerging. What does that mean? That instead of lots of city states and hamlets around Europe and the world being the dominant force, a handful of states become important. And over the time of these many centuries, we talk about a Westphalian system. We're really talking about a system where states interact, where their heads of government are in fact, the representatives of the people inside those states. So it goes back to my opening comment. When we talk about national sovereignty in the US, in particular, we're talking about political and territorial sovereignty, that a state is intact when it controls its borders, it has well-defined territorial borders, and it has a political system of government that represents the people. There are many other more complicated or maybe even less complicated ways to talk about it, but this is a good starting point as a working definition.
Mm, That's very interesting. And it's very cool that you looked even before the founding of the United States for our definition of national sovereignty. But I'm curious about kind of something you mentioned, about kind of using states as proxies for kind of the integrity of the people. And I was curious, then how do we view national sovereignty differently when we're talking about an authoritarian state versus a democracy? Because it seems to me that in a democracy, people are electing their leaders, so maybe we can view that more directly, um, as standing in for people. But for instance, in an authoritarian state where power was seized and control of a state or its foreign policy is being determined by maybe an illegitimate leader considered by the people, like, does that affect our understanding of national sovereignty?
Um, Again, another pointed question, and I'm glad you asked it. The Biden administration really has focused on this idea of marking off democratic representative government from more authoritarian type regimes. That's something that President Biden, before he became president, really emphasized in his speeches and writings during the Trump era and even before when he was not in the Oval Office. And I get what they're talking about because even though, as you point out, a nation state, not every nation states are the same internally, and not all of them represent their people through the ballot box, through all of the processes that we understand derived from our own constitution. But they're still nation states. They still have a seat at the UN General Assembly. And their internal constitution, however they are so organized, doesn't necessarily mean that they're stuck. Many authoritarian regimes get overthrown and more representative governments come in. Sometimes representative governments come in and then there is a democratic backsliding. But in the main, they have the features of what we call a nation state, some type of political and territorial integrity to them that, um, may or may not represent their people in the way that we would want, but they are so constituted that they have a seat at the biggest international organization of all, the United Nations. So when I think about a nation state, I don't I look at the UN membership. Who gets there? Not all states do. There's some that don't have a seat, that are contested in terms of their status. You've got China, but not Taiwan, for example. But I tend to say, let me start there. And then I go back to that definition, political and territorial integrity, saying that's the highest goal from our standpoint as Americans, I think, of what a nation state should be.
Yeah, that was a very clear explanation. Um, but I'm curious about how, I guess, practically we can determine a country's legitimate borders versus a contested border, since obviously, if there's a contested border, both sides will very ardently argue that that is their
Yes,
true legitimate border. Like Russia would argue that Ukraine is genuinely their territory, and the US is encroaching on their border by protecting Ukraine. Same with China and Taiwan and other disputes. So, kind of what are the practical mechanisms we can apply to try to get at some, I guess, less subjective view of like what a legitimate border is?
so hard to ask, to try to even grapple with that question. And what I can say is it's a work in progress. I don't think that, first of all, many of the carve up of the world has its own features of peculiarity, of, cultural moments and bias, colonialism and imperialism. And so we're always going to have contested borders, and we're going to have contested waters, and contested airspace, because that's the nature, I think, of nation states, is that they sometimes evolve. And what we see, if I give you the globe, a copy of the globe, and say, here's the actual globe, 1989, and I give you a copy of the globe today, it's going to look slightly different. And wars are fought because of borders, trying to shift from left to right or from right to left, trying to grab part of a waterway. This is the nature of the international system, and I think you went straight to it. It's really, really hard. So we have this pristine idea of the nation state, and then we have and generally we understand what certain borders look like, and we understand where people vote and where they, pay taxes, and where they have a say in who governs, even if it's an authoritarian system. But there are always contests on the outside about what those borders should be. So in North America, for example, we're pretty clear on our borders, the US and Canada. I don't think we're going to war about who's who and what's what. I don't think we're going to war with Mexico on our border. We know who's who and what's what. But we do have a problem on our border, our southern border, with illegals coming over. And we sometimes blame Mexico, we sometimes don't. We blame ourselves, we blame our legislators in Washington, we blame sanctuary cities and so forth. I think you're talking about the fact that a couple of things. One, borders are often under contest. If the world could be US and Canada everywhere, what a great world we could be in generally. So there's often contest about borders. It doesn't look so much like, the northern part of North America. And then also what happens at the borders, even when a nation state feels a certain way, sometimes the nations on the other side have a different idea. So even when people feel a certain way about their borders internally, it doesn't mean those outside of those borders feel the same way, which means there's always some kind of contest going on. And sometimes that contest becomes comes to dominate a state. Sometimes it just simmers over time. And it's different in different parts of the world. Some borders, although they're contested, aren't particularly dangerous, and then some are incredibly dangerous. So the US-Mexico border, it has its dangerous features for reasons that we don't even have to repeat here, that we're watching in real time. But then India, Pakistan, particularly dangerous because they both have nuclear weapons and they both have real gripes. And so, we can go every region of the world and find a border contest, and they're pretty severe. But in the march of history, in the modern era and the last few centuries, we're headed more toward the nation state as the core unit of analysis, then tribes, then smaller communities, then statehoods, and we still have different identities. We believe, many of us have, we're part of a diaspora from our ethnic background, but we still identify as Americans. And, for all of its problems, and we have many on any given day that we can't resolve, the United States, as the nation state that it is the destination for much of the world for people who want freedom, prosperity, opportunity. And they're willing to embrace, or at least some, our version of a nation state. There are many who want to come here and reform us, but we're incredibly resistant as a nation and resilient. And somehow we've held on to who we are for quite some time.
Yeah, that was I know it was a very complicated question, and you did a great job addressing it.
I
So I'm
don't
curious
think so. I don't think so.
that it's not
But we keep
complicated,
keep
or
going.
that
I know it's not, it's definitely complicated. I'm not sure how good I was. You're asking really hard questions. If I had known from your host how hard your questions would be, I may have said, I slipped on a banana peel this morning, can't do the interview. But it's great. And this reminds me, I was talking about this yesterday. One of my professors, I did my PhD at Harvard, and I asked him my first year, I said, what students, what level, undergraduate, graduate students do you find most difficult to teach or most challenging? And he said freshmen. And he said because they ask questions that appear to be simple, but they're really complicated. They don't have filters. They haven't bought into one school or thought or another. They aren't biased yet. They aren't defending a point of view. That's what I'm identifying in you.
well, thank you. I'm glad you didn't slip on a banana peel and were able to be here because this is very helpful. Like I am, it's helpful to even contextualize like the terms of the debate, even if no one has a good answer. So this is great. I was curious about this idea you keep coming back to about, the nation state being kind of the legitimate actor in foreign policy, which I think is generally like the understanding. But I was curious how America's system of federalism affects that understanding, because on the show we've talked a lot about um, power being distributed to the states and how each state can have its own values and culture and history and even interests. And maybe that even extends to the national stage. But obviously, then when it comes to foreign policy, we treat the US as much more of a monolith. So could you just speak a bit more to this dichotomy and in your experience working in those spaces?
Another tough question. So go back to our original Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And that was our governing document for the beginning of a national government for these 13 colonies/states. But what was the problem there? They all had their entrenched local cultures and traditions and even kind of political beliefs that were divergent, but they also had separate currencies. Some of them had fledgling foreign policies. Nothing was working. They barely could call up a military if they needed. So we have a history of like deep federalism, so much so that we had to have a constitutional convention to fix what we started with, to bring together a more central government that had more power. And then while that was going on, we had a huge debate. The Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists, both were strong. Features of both are represented in our system. I tell everyone when they say, our founding fathers said this, our founding fathers said that, the framers said this, the framers said that. There was a huge debate that we were in fact founded on a tension, not a consensus. So we have a built-in tension at the level of federalism that we do still have states and localities with distinct political traditions and cultures. We have now one currency. We're not using the special currency that states once had. And states don't necessarily have separate foreign policies, but they actually have many, especially I'm here in California. I'm talking to you from beautiful Malibu, looking out at the ocean. States that have delegations that go abroad, that develop ties abroad. And we do, we have the centralized federal government with a State Department, a Defense Department, and ultimately those should trump what goes down on states at state level delegations, but they can complicate the system as well. And so I'm glad you asked this question because we have a system where power is dispersed. I like to say that we have 51 sovereigns. We've got 50 states, and then we've got a federal government. But it's even more than that because we've got 50 states with three branches of government and a federal government with three branches of government. There's a lot of sovereignty going on here and a lot of hands believing that they are the sovereign on any particular issue. Then somehow we're supposed to unify and get represented with one voice on the UN Security Council and the General Assembly. I think you get our picture, the picture I'm painting here. But when you go back to that tension of the framers, the founders, they kind of wanted it this way. And so when people say we're so chaotic now, there's so much chaos in American politics, out of that, probably we get better representation because even still, we get, powerful elites and blocks of power, but we kind of can break it up through our political process with the sheer number of actors that can become involved. So on the one hand, we're internally, the rest of the world looks at us. These people are nuts. They've got so much going on. There's so much noise. Where is the town square? Well, the town square happens to be everywhere. My local community, outside of the state capitol, on the steps, outside of the Supreme Court steps, it's everywhere. But somehow we still come together on really big moments and surge as a nation and devolve authority to our federal representatives on big international moments. So I'm writing a book now about the interwar period, the 1930s between World War I and World War II, and the war debate that was taking place. Americans were, if you think this period is divided, divisive, acrimonious, mean-spirited, go back to the 30s and you'll put it all in perspective. The isolationists, the interventionists, some were called the war hawks. Those who wanted war were called part of the Uni Party. I mean, people were maligning each other, trying to kill their careers. FDR was being deceptive. Everyone, was um, um, concerned about their neighbor and what he or she may have been doing. But when Pearl Harbor happened, that huge swath of Americans who had been opposed to war suited up and went to battle. And I think that's a unique feature of our system. We debate so much in the public square that, as Churchill said, count on Americans to do the right thing after they've done the wrong thing. They've debated too much. I think we get there. So I think the chaos of our system gets us off into a better place, though it's painful. Can we become more politically mature and have more mature civil society? Yes, I want to see that. But some features are always going to be there. So, really try to answer your very big question. Our internal system of too many sovereigns, and political maturity, civil society getting more entrenched than it ever has been, um, makes the world think that we can't make big decisions, but then somehow we do. And that always gives me hope.
That was a very optimistic. I really like that interpretation. And then I was just curious, just a quick question before I pass along. I know that this on this note about kind of more local influences on foreign policy. I know Undersecretary Blinken, the State Department just added a unit on subnational diplomacy and an ambassador to cities. So I was curious, as somebody who has experience working at the State Department, what you think of that and whether you think that is kind of an acknowledgement of like an increasing role of local authority in foreign policy.
Can you be a little more precise in that question?
Sure. The State Department just established a sub-national diplomacy unit focusing on engaging with states and cities on national diplomacy, and it appears that this is the first time that there's that sort of mechanism in government. So do you think this reflects an awareness from the national government that cities and states are becoming more influential in foreign policy?
I do, and I think it always has been there. It's just, we're catching up to the reality of the world. For example, during COVID, one of the things that the Beijing government did in the Western Hemisphere and nations like Brazil, with a government at the time, Bolsonaro, who wasn't particularly friendly toward what communist China stands for, is that they built relationships with mayors and with governors, providing PPE and building ties. And I actually think that is where the U.S. should have been a long time ago, but it has been there before. If you look closely at our diplomacy, we've always had those kinds of ties with religious groups within states, within and at the subnational level. That's where people live. And so I think a better understanding of culture and language and what people care about always matters. And so I don't give up on our State Department. I think it's the oldest cabinet department for the US, which means it has some of the features of age. But I do think the world is changing in a way that we're realizing, one, that power and influence within states beyond the federal level does matter. It matters to us more in the Western Hemisphere now, I think, than almost ever, because for the first time, we have almost a majority of nations in the region between and South America and the Caribbean that are democratically elected, um, progressive, some socialist oriented, more far left, so to speak, regimes. And we're going to have to work with them. But if we're going to build for the future, we also need relationships with people who are emerging as leaders down below, who are mayors and city councilmen and so on. So I think part of our future is building those ties, which we should always be doing everywhere in the world. We get a better sense of who's who. And also in terms of the US, I think, at the state and local level, our foreign policy officials would do a better job if they understood America. That America is not the Beltway. It's not the dozen or 2 dozen think tanks that are always running in and out of the offices of government. That people in communities have something to say. One of the reasons I think Trump got elected in 2016, to the surprise of many elites, not to the surprise of many Americans, was that he was spending time in my former state of Pennsylvania, where I'd lived for 22 years. And he was going into that vast middle, the flyover states, and he was talking about things that no foreign policy expert, no political operative would tell you to talk about in the campaign, because it would be a complete yawn. He was saying, we need NATO to pay its fair share. We need burden sharing. If you've got a membership that's 29 strong, I think that was the NATO membership at that point, and only 4 or 5 of the countries are reaching the 2% of GDP toward mutual defense that the whole body agreed to years earlier. And the US is paying, the biggest amount. This is not a security alliance. This is a dependency alliance. And it made sense to a lot of Americans. And then elites were shocked. Like, no one's going to vote for someone that's going to touch in any way the most successful security alliance in at least modern history. But then we stopped and we ran the numbers. And it was the US, UK, maybe Poland, Estonia, maybe Greece that were reaching that pledge. What about Germany? What about France? What about some of our other members? By the end of the Trump administration, that number had doubled, I think, and hundreds of billions more into defense into mutual defense from the NATO members. And now NATO's expanded, and you've got Finland, which is a very capable NATO member, and more border space with Russia. So I do think these issues matter, and Americans care about them down in states. And sometimes, if we would listen to Americans in states and local communities, we actually might have better foreign policy. How's that for a big
Well, thank you.
idea?
No, that was great. I loved that. And thank you so much for, your time and insights and experience. Wish I could talk forever, but I will now pass on to Jewel and Jordan.
Thanks.
Hello, thank you for everything so far. It's been a pleasure listening to these huge ideas. I have a really big question that you can tell me if I need to present it differently. But as we were talking about war, sovereignty, international relations, when our founders' understanding of international relations, we often debate about, and there will be a debate about how isolationist they were or not, or they weren't. But anytime a nation acts in aggression, they have to put their self-interest above another nation's sovereignty. Maybe not every time, but very often. A nation has to impede on another nation's sovereignty in order for their own self-interest. So could you maybe answer what threshold did our founders seek in order to do that? And in our modern era, with politics being much more global, do you think that we, as an American electorate, as American people, need to have a more clear vision of when we act in our own self-interest, and we are going to impede on another nation's sovereignty? When do we do that? What threat does there have to be? What reason is there going to be that's going to say, yes, we have to act in our self-interest, which may mean that we are going to step on your sovereignty?
Great question. And I think this goes to a core, I think, potential contradiction in a foreign policy that's driven by this idea that the nation state's the core unit. What it really is saying, and it relates to what you've just said, is that you're asserting that there's an objective definition of the national interest, and that definition, if it guides your nation, means that you may encroach on the sovereignty of another nation, or that it may put you in real disputes that actually lead to war. So in the Trump administration, for example, Trump talked about this. If you read every UN General Assembly speech, his 4 speeches, as president, I think they are a coherent body of work around the issues that we're talking about in this broadcast. And he is talking about, he's telling nations, he's talking about America first, but he's saying every nation should be thinking this way, that your national interest governs. I was thinking, aha, I see what you're saying. I actually agree, but we're already now immediately in conflict with some of our friends and allies, and definitely with some of our adversaries. But what I think he was expecting is that if we're all driven by our national interests, not by the interest of some unelected group of bureaucrats in Brussels, or some unelected bureaucrats in the UN system, or some faction in the General Assembly that has a grievance against the whole system, that we'll actually be clearer on what the interests are. And that clarity and transparency will make it easier for us to do business and maybe block war. So I think you're right on the one side, that once other nations get really, if everyone had their own America first, for example, that right there brings tension, brings conflict, maybe makes it harder to get an international agreement through. But I think the Trump perspective was that's a better negotiating starting point than what we've had before, which is a murky set of actors who really don't represent anybody but themselves and their interest. So I think this is a fundamental tension.
I'd just like to tag on to what you said. You just made me think of it as you were talking that oftentimes people will conflate putting yourself first with turning your back on someone else or purposefully hurting someone else. And I think that has to be a very clear distinction from people to understand that my good can be your good too.
I actually believe that because I don't believe you have to sacrifice your commitment to your national interests to help someone else. I don't think it's these are false binary opposites that critics of this whole approach have put forth. Let's run the experiment and see. One, but you have to also put it in a political a cultural and political context. No matter what really governing principle you put forth for the United States, we're an incredibly generous people. And we run into the fire all over the world. And, just look at our global philanthropy, both private and public. It's phenomenal. It's just part of our DNA. And so I don't think we ever abandon the rest of the world because we want to get a lot more rigorous about the wars that we become involved in, about the trade agreements that we sign, about the climate agreements that we adhere to. I I just don't see this kind of, these opposites that are simplistically imposed on the idea of um, trying to live up to your national interests. Now, I do have another question, though, and concern is that, and it's a big one, the national interest, what is it? And does it float from administration to the administration? Can we ever get a objective definition? But part of what our partners abroad are saying, and even our adversaries, America's flipping from one to the next too much from administration to administration. And it's hard for us to get a clear guide of where we're going. If we had an objective understanding of the national interest that was much more perhaps nuanced and deeper, I don't think we would be flipping around as much. And so there, I think we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. We can't be in the Paris Climate Accord one day, out the next, back in a few years later. That's too confusing for the world, and we do lose credibility.
Yes, and what was the time it is quickly? We're fine. Okay, so I have another question. Thank you for your answers. They are definitely fascinating, and I know our audience is getting so much out of it. I have another bigger question, that a similar type of question that about war itself. In my studies and learning and things have come. It seems like in general, when we go way back, at some point, every sovereign nation fought to be there. There was war, and yet today, not a lot of our national debate comes around legitimacy of a sovereign nation, which we touched on before. But very oftentimes, what's used against a nation is they'll say, well, they got it through some violent means, or etc. They fought a war to be there, and now they're there, and they displaced whoever was indigenous there. But if you go back, whoever was there probably displaced somebody indigenously that was there before them. So I'm wondering in our foreign policy and how we think about sovereignty, do we have to answer this question about war, time frame of war, how recent a war was, and is war just, and is every nation born out of war?
Can you sharpen that question for me, please?
Yeah, if when we think about our foreign policy, does it matter do we need to come to a agreement or a decision whether a nation can be born out of war and be legitimate in a modern time?
Um, all nations are born out of war for the most part. If you go back, I think you're saying, how far do we have to go back? And let
Basically,
me
yeah, yeah,
let
because
me rephrase the question. I think there's another question that you're really asking. Um, so nation construction is a messy business. And there's just not one piece of land and one day some people come on and say, let's build this wonderful state. But that what I think you're really saying, there are indigenous factors always, and it's not pretty and somebody loses. Sometimes there's a genocide. There's a lot of bloodshed. There are a lot of unfair features to it. What I would say is that every state has an original sin. Every state has political, historical, and cultural blemishes. And part of, I think the what it means to be a mature state, especially one that's representative, is that you're constantly um, revisiting those original sins and saying we have to improve who we are if we're going to be a beacon to the world. And if our international system is going to be more just, we have to be just at home. Um, I actually believe what has made the United States such an attractive destination for all those people around the world who want to escape repression, who want freedom and opportunity, is not that we have racism, that we have sexism, that we have all kinds of bias, is that we're constantly trying to improve and that we kind of put it all out there for people to see. And no one can really sweep it under the rug as much as they'd like to. It comes out, and that we litigate these issues, we take it before the court, we legislate on them, and we have a really thick and robust civil society. We have in the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, the most mature civil rights organization, I think, in the world, that has a huge legislative success record, especially in the previous century, at mid-century. So all those sins are there. Often it's war. We have an American Revolutionary War to get rid of our war, our former masters. And then, if you look at our original founding, you have every war in American history. People of color have been part of it. They were fighting for freedoms they didn't have. Then in our two big wars, World War I and World War II, the most devastating wars in world history, the shadow of which we're living in today. We don't want that ever to happen again. The world had never seen that level of devastation, that utter destruction, the use of the nuclear bomb. And then those boys and girls came back who were, many of them of color who could not get jobs, who were being, lynch mobs were after them. That's part of who we are, but we don't shy away from it. We don't get the conversation right, but we have that conversation every single day in this country. And I think it helps us. So I think I'm getting to your question in a backhanded way by saying, whatever we think of a nation state, we got to, you go back and it's not a pretty history. And you've got, the UK right now. And I've been watching this, as best I can, given all the assignments that I have in my life, but really going and looking critically at their colonial past and, and apologizing for slavery, apologizing for their role in a lot of the abuse. I think that's what nations are faced with doing. And I actually think it makes them more whole. And I think it starts clarifying the national interest in a way, going back to our larger point.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your time today. Really appreciate all the information you've given us. And now we're going to pass to Kathy for some audience questions.
Well, thank you, Joel and Jorn and Taube. Great questions. And Dr. Skinner, we're just, again, so honored to have you with us today. I know, as Joel said, our audience is getting a lot out of this discussion. We want to take a minute and recognize our teachers and students who are watching with us today. We have Cami Waynehouse watching with a homeschool student, And we have Carol Reedy, who teaches an after-school program, who is watching with 12 students. So we welcome all our teachers and students. If I didn't give you a shout out and you're watching, please type in the Q&A and we'll make sure to do that. We also want to thank our listeners in Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the dial in Las Vegas. We appreciate all of our listeners in Las Vegas who tune in at 6 p.m. Pacific on Mondays to hear the rebroadcast of this podcast. So, Dr. Skinner, we've got a lot of questions here. We've got some interest in your book. Teresa Speak, who's one of our regular listeners, and I also want to recognize that it's Teresa's birthday. So happy birthday, Teresa. Teresa asks, what is the title of Dr. Skinner's book? And then also Mary asks when your book is coming out. And Mary also says, thanks for mentioning the time frame between the wars. I don't hear much about that time frame. And Mary said both her grandfathers were in both grandfathers were in World War I and her dad was in World War II. So maybe tell us a little bit more about your book and the title.
I don't have the title yet. Actually the publishers get the first dibs on titles, but it's about the war debate. And it really, for me, you can't go back to the 1930s in America too much to understand America. You can't go back to the 1930s too much if you're interested in understanding the world. And so I found myself there trying to get answers about where we are right now. And I felt I can't get answers about the present without going back to the past. And I think that's what motivated me on this topic. And so, and I think it's a time that where Americans were coming to fuller power on the international stage. My book is about a few demographics about Jewish Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, African Americans, who were seen to have fewer rights than in the 1930s than they actually do now. In the American South, many African Americans couldn't vote. They were terrorized. They couldn't get to the polling place. They have sliding rules and regulations about voting that were locally determined. And what's been striking to me, all of these groups, Japanese put in internment camps ultimately, Chinese Americans maligned on the West Coast, Jewish Americans fighting with the State Department to get the quotas up, to get Jews out of Europe. Despite all of that, these Americans use the levers of democracy to make their case for their rights in the middle of this hot period of the 1930s, where the world was starting to blow up, but also to try to frame how they thought America should go to war. That for me was so interesting, and it goes back to what the young men just asked me about war and the creation of nation states. For the Chinese Americans, World War II starts really early. It's with Japan's invasion of Manchuria in the early 1930s. For African Americans, many, especially those in Harlem, but also down south, who were thinking about these issues, World War II starts pretty early in the mid-30s with the Italo-Abyssinian War, with Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. And then soon thereafter with the Spanish Civil War. For Jewish Americans, it's really, about quotas, especially as Hitler's coming to power. And they use the arguments of democracy, they use the levers of democracy to make their case, and they did it boldly and without fear. I find that fascinating. And they were also talking to each other. They were also talking to white Americans. They were talking to everyone. They were trying to get to FDR. They were trying to get to the State Department, to the War Department. To me, in an odd way, that's America becoming mature, politically mature, in the face of a period that's often described by scholars as one of our most, divided and repressive times. I'm seeing a level of democratic optimism and a sophistication about the global nature of World War II. That it starts in Asia, that it ends up on the African continent, that it's in Europe, and you've got Americans making the case for this multi-front conflict, very sophisticated, at a time when we thought, many historians say, oh, they're too oppressed. and that they were too radical when they made arguments. Some of these people were radical. They were, you know, more Marxist, what we would say Marxist in orientation, but they were still fundamentally American in what they were doing and saying.
Well, thank you. And we had another person, Bob DeMartino, who asked that we be sure and alert all our listeners when it is published. So there's a lot of interest here in the audience on your book, which is great. Kay Morrison asks, the U.S. does not accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, while most other countries do. Please explain why the U.S. has taken a different course than other nations.
You know, the United States is, first of all, you know, there's a lot of variety in the world on International Court of Justice and international courts in general. It's not that the U.S. is completely out of lockstep with many nations in the world. And sometimes this changes again based on who comes to power within a state. They dial it back on, you know, the ICJ and other international forums. So I want to make that statement. But in terms of the United States, and you know, not to make it so special, but it is special. Any nation that's the predominant nation on earth is in a unique position for the rest of the world. And so it's not that the US should be exempted from criminal behavior as so described. I would never say that. But the United States, if you think about 1945, end of World War II, to about 1965 or 1970, the United States is objectively the predominant power on earth. More nuclear weapons, first to get the bomb, sets up the international financial structure, sets up UN and other international organizations, provides for the rebuilding of Europe, you know, provides for much of the development in Latin America, provides extended deterrence through NATO and some other agreements to much of the world because they couldn't protect themselves. We're not quite in that position now, but we still do a lot. We don't control as much global GDP as we did back then, but we do fight a lot of wars. We do try to help everyone. When you're carrying that kind of load in the world, I think you look at international organizations and courts with a different set of eyes. And on any given day, I feel better about the world because the United States is at the top. And people say, why do you know, why have you gone into government? It's so painful now. People talk about you, they write mean things, you know, it's really hard. Because the reason that I hang in there is that for the reason I just stated, the United States provides a lot for the rest of the world. If I can support our nation in buying all of us one more generation of freedom with the United States as a predominant force in the world, it's worth it. Because for what I have seen across US history, and since we rose to power, so to speak, 1898 with the Spanish American War, the world's better off when we're engaged. And I think it's going to be even more um, an even better actor because of the young people on this call who I think have a much broader understanding of US history, not just the narrow conception that we were being taught. Let me turn the phone off here, and I'm sorry about that.
I think
Sorry
Dr. Skinner.
about that. Sometime life happens, and so I've turned the phone off. But I really do think you all are so well positioned because you're not going to accept, and I feel it in the questions that have been presented so far, a narrow antiseptic definition of US history. You do care about Native peoples. You do care about the judicious use of force. All of that is going to make us better. I think a more responsible leader in the world.
Well, thank you, Dr. Skinner. That's what great comments to close on. And we're right at the top of the hour, and we know that you've got a very busy day ahead of you. So I want to thank you again for being with us, and thank our audience members for being with us, and ask that you all join us next week, Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be talking about the Constitution and the U.S. border. And I'll just throw it real quick to Tova and to Jewel and Jorn for any closing comments y'all might want to make.
Thank you all so much for joining us this week and every week.
Yes, we hope to see you again next week. And thank you to Dr. Skinner for an incredible podcast.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Skinner. We really, really are honored to have you. Thank you.